Hi, I'm Dr. Zabelin, and I'm presenting the NUCA component to the Diplomate program for looking at the differences in upper cervical techniques. So I thought I'd start out with a presentation on the history of NUCA, or as I like to call it, the history of the world according to NUCA. So originally, in 1934, Dr. A. Wernsing, a chiropractor in California, begins teaching a new approach to upper cervical adjusting and publishes a book titled Atlas Specific. I actually have a copy of this book, but not an original, unfortunately. And what's remarkable about Dr. Wernsing was he was the first person to actually set up upper cervical segments, bony specimens, inside of a frame that he had wired with turnbuckles. And what he would do is turn the turnbuckles a little bit, measure the displacement on the specimen, and then take an x-ray and see if he could reproduce that on the x-ray. And it turns out that was a reasonable approach. And so began the world of using x-rays to look at misalignments, primarily in the upper cervical spine. In 1946, John Grostic Sr. introduces the Grostic technique. He'd been working at the time with Ralph Gregory, DC, but in 46 they parted. And they continued to develop our cervical approach. Dr. Grostic Sr. was the first person to receive the D.D. Palmer Award, which, given the political and philosophical climate in Palmer College in those years, you have to understand how significant this would have been because, the controls were very tight about what was being taught and what was being admitted as chiropractic. So in 1964, Grostic Sr. dies and upper cervical work splintered into what remained as the Grostic work with John Grostic Jr., NUCA work, which was with Dr. Gregory, orthogonality, Atlas orthogonal, which was a Dr. Sweat piece, CBP, Pettibon, Sonar, total support variants, and others. And I know I've omitted a few. It's complicated. In 1973, NUCRA was formed, which was the National Upper Cervical Chiropractic Association, to research the upper cervical reduction. It's registered in the state of Michigan as a 401c tax-deductible organization so that any donations are tax-deductible for donors. In 1975, NUCRA and NUCA introduced the anatometer. Now, the anatometer was originally developed by Dr. Gregory, and the machinist and designer was Benish Corporation. And Mr. Benish was a good friend of Dr. Gregory's and built the anatometer really out of demonstration of his friendship for Dr. Gregory. And it was a massively overbuilt instrument that was expensive, but it was also there isn't one that isn't working in today's world, even though they began so long ago. And the original ones had foot levelers that would balance a patient's leg length discrepancy once they had a good reduction. And that was later adapted into an electronic model that had weight differential with transducers and would also then give all the other instruments in a digital readout as well. In 1986, Dr. Gregory received a tribute from then President Ronald Reagan. And what's significant about that is that Dr. Gregory was the first chiropractor to be ever received in the White House. In 1987, Dr. Gregory himself received the D.D. Palmer Award. In 1990, Dr. Gregory dies on March 1st. Dr. Birdie, a doctor in British Columbia and a longtime student of Dr. Gregory's, assumes the presidency. And in 1998, Dr. Birdie resigns along with some board members for political, philosophical, and personal reasons. And this, of course, was a very difficult time for NUCA. We lost some of our original instructors, and the organization had to pick up the pieces and kind of move on, and so we did. Now, in 2002, NUCA and NUCRA published the NUCA Protocols and Perspectives, a textbook for the National Upper Cervical Chiropractic Association. I was honored to be asked to author a chapter in that book on X-ray analysis, which I did. And the book is probably the last paper edition that we'll see, because we're working on a new edition which will be internet-based and digital. In 2007, Dr. Bakris, who's a cardiologist, publishes a study in an index journal. It was a double-blind study demonstrating the lowering of hypertension utilizing the NUCA procedure. And the way that ran was that there was 100 cases. 50 of them were test subjects. The other 50 were control. And all of them received pre-X-rays and post-X-rays. The test group received the NUCA adjustment with a verified reduction on post-X-ray, whereas the control group received a sham adjustment, also by Dr. Dickholz, and post-X-rays which demonstrated that the spine had not moved. There was no reduction. And it was monitored for, it was either 6 or 8 weeks, I forget which. And the outcome was that the test group had a reduction of systolic hypertension by about 17 millimeters of mercury over the course of the experiment, and it was mostly done with just one adjustment. The control group had about a 2 millimeter drop in blood pressure over the same period. So this was a significant difference between the intervention of the test group and the control group. Now, NUCA has conferences that are held biannually with a 3-tier program, and it runs simultaneously to help everybody from the beginner as well as the more advanced doctors. And then we have special classes for doctors both in certification and pursuing certification. There are many more important highlights in NUCA's history. For example, the development of the 4 basic types, and we'll do a separate PowerPoint on that later on in the program. NUCA looks at the way that the cervical spine atlas and the skull misalign as falling into 4 general categories, and each one has requirements for height vector, headpiece placement, and what support to use. The triceps pull biomechanics is something that is characteristic of the NUCA procedure, and this is a light adjustment that does not utilize depth in the adjustment. We also had headpiece placement. There are 4 points on the skull which are used to set for different types, and there are 2 separate headpiece types with 4 departments or 4 compartments on those. And then we also have a multi-support headpiece, which is used by some doctors. The center of gravity of the skull measurement. This was done as an experiment both in the university at Hayward in California and the University of Toledo in Ohio. And we had 2 researchers who took skulls that were both anthropological, racial, gender, and age. And they were each suspended from 3 points, and where those 3 lines intersected was the center of gravity. And this is a standard measure for the center of gravity. And what was found was that the center of gravity on these dry specimen skulls, regardless of what group they came from, to be roughly between the eyes, about 1 inch above the auditory meatus, the bony meatus. The notch transverse resultant was developed, and that's a line that is very important in the biomechanics of NUCA. It's a line that goes from the doctor's episternal notch to the contact, and this is used as a calculation for the doctor's stance. We also have the phases of the adjustment. In other words, there are 8 phases, and there's a separate presentation on that. So there's a whole protocol on how a doctor should stand for each adjustment, and part of it takes into account the doctor's stance, and part of it takes into account the particulars of the misalignment of the patient. And so both of those are brought together into a single calculation, which then allows the doctor to assume that position in order to deliver the optimal adjustment.